Part 1 of Chapter 9 of The Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, translated by William Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ryan Smallwood. Chapter 9. Third subdivision of Logic. The Doctrine of Notion. The notion is the principle of freedom, the power of substance self-realized. It is a systematic whole, in which each of the constituent functions is the very total of which the notion is, and is put as indissolubly one with it. Thus, in its self-identity it has original and complete determinateness. The position taken up by the notion is that of absolute idealism. Philosophy is a knowledge through notions, because it sees what on other grades of consciousness is taken to have being, and to be naturally or immediately independent, is but a constituent stage in the idea. In the logic of understanding, the notion is generally reckoned a mere form of thought, and treated as a general conception. It is to this inferior view of the notion that the assertion refers, so often urged on behalf of the heart and sentiment, that notions as such are something dead, empty, and abstract. The case is really quite the reverse. The notion is, on the contrary, the principle of all life, and thus possesses at the same time a character of thorough concreteness. That it is so follows from the whole logical movement up to this point, and need not be here proved. The contrast between form and content, which is thus used to criticize the notion when it is alleged to be merely formal, has, like all other contrasts upheld by reflection, already been left behind and overcome dialectically or through itself. The notion, in short, is what contains all the earlier categories of thought merged in it. It certainly is a form, but an infinite and creative form which includes, but at the same time releases from itself, the fullness of all content. And so too the notion may, if it be wished, be styled abstract, if the name concrete is restricted to the concrete facts of sense or of immediate perception. For the notion is not palpable to the touch, and when we engage with it, hearing and seeing must quite fail us. And yet, as it was before remarked, the notion is a true concrete, for the reason that it involves being and essence, and the total wealth of these two spheres, with them merged into the unity of thought. If, as was said in an earlier point, the different stages of the logical idea are to be treated as a series of definitions of the absolute, the definition which now results for us is that the absolute is the notion. That necessitates a higher estimate of the notion, however, than is found in formal conceptual logic, where the notion is a mere form of our subjective thought, with no original content of its own. But if speculative logic thus attaches a meaning to the term notion, so very different from that usually given, it may be asked why the same word should be employed in two contrary acceptations, and an occasion thus given for confusion and misconception. The answer is that, great as the interval is between the speculative notion and the notion of formal logic, closer examination shows that the deeper meaning is not so foreign to the general usages of language as it seems at first sight. We speak of the deduction of a content from the notion, for example, of the specific provisions of the law of property from the notion of property. And so again, we speak of tracing back these material details to the notion. We thus recognize that the notion is no mere form without a content of its own. For if it were, there would be in the one case nothing to deduce from such a form, and in the other case to trace a given body of fact back to the empty form of the notion would only rob the fact of its specific character without making it understood. The onward movement of the notion is no longer either a transition into or reflection on something else, but development. For in the notion the elements distinguished are without more ado at the same time declared to be identical with one another and with the whole. And the specific character of each is a free being of the whole notion. Transition into something else is the dialectical process within the range of being. Reflection, bringing something else into light, is the range of essence. The movement of the notion is development, by which that only is explicit which is already implicitly present. In the world of nature, it is organic life that corresponds to the grade of the notion. Thus, for example, the plant is developed from its germ. The germ virtually involves the whole plant, but does so only ideally or in thought, and it would therefore be a mistake to regard the development of the root, stem, leaves, and other different parts of the plant as meaning that they were realiter present, but in a very minute form, in the germ. That is the so-called box within box hypothesis, a theory which commits the mistake of supposing an actual existence of what is at first found only as a postulate of the complete thought. The truth of the hypothesis, on the other hand, lies in its perceiving that in the process of development the notion keeps to itself and only gives rise to alteration of form, without making any addition in point of content. It is this nature of the notion, this manifestation of itself in its process as development of its own self, which is chiefly in view with those who speak of innate ideas, or who, like Plato, describe all learning merely as reminiscence. Of course, that again does not mean that everything which is embodied in a mind, after that mind has been formed by instruction, have been present in the mind beforehand, in its definitely expanded shape. The movement of the notion is as it were to be looked upon as mere play. The other which it sets up is in reality not another, or it is expressed in the teaching of Christianity. Not merely has God created a world which confronts him as another, he has also from all eternity begotten a Son in whom he, a spirit, is at home with himself. The doctrine of notion is divided into three parts. 1. The first is the doctrine of the subjective or formal notion. 2. The second is the doctrine of the notion invested with the character of immediacy or of objectivity. 3. The third is the doctrine of the idea, the subject-object, the unity of notion and objectivity, the absolute truth. The common logic covers only the matters which come before us here as a portion of the third part of the whole system, together with the so-called laws of thought which we have already met. And in the applied logic it adds a little about cognition. This is combined with psychological, metaphysical, and all sorts of empirical materials, which were introduced because, when all was done, those forms of thought could not be made to do all that was required of them. But with these additions, the science lost its unity of aim. Then there was a further circumstance against common logic. Those forms, which at least do belong to the proper domain of logic, are supposed to be categories of conscious thought only, of thought too in the character of understanding, not of reason. The preceding logical categories, those viz. Being and essence, are, it is true, no mere logical modes or entities. They are proved to be notions in their transition, or their dialectical element, and in return into themselves and totality. But they are only in a modified form notions rudimentary, or, what is the same thing, notions for us. The antithetical term into which each category passes, or in which it shines, so producing correlation, is not characterized as a particular. The third, in which they return to unity, is not characterized as a subject or an individual, nor is there any explicit statement that the category is identical in its antithesis. In other words, its freedom is not expressly stated. And all this because the category is not universality. What generally passes current under the name of a notion is a mode of understanding, or even a mere general representation, and therefore, in short, a finite model of thought. The logic of the notion is usually treated as a science of form only, and understood to deal with the form of notion, judgment, syllogism as form, without in the least touching on the question of whether anything is true. The answer to that question is supposed to depend on the content only. If the logical form of the notion were really dead and inert receptacles of conceptions and thoughts, careless of what they contained, knowledge about them would be an idle curiosity, which the truth might dispense with. On the contrary, they really are, as forms of the notion, the vital spirit of the actual world. That only is true of the actual which is true in virtue of these forms, through them and in them. And yet, however, the truth of these forms has never been considered or examined on their own account any more than their necessary interconnection. A. The subjective notion. The notion as notion. The notion as notion contains the three following moments or functional parts. 1. The first is universality, meaning that it is free equality with itself in its specific character. 2. The second is particularity, that is, the specific character in which the universal continues serenely equal to itself. 3. The third is individuality, meaning the reflection into self of the specific characters of universality and particularity, which negative self-unity has complete and original determinateness without any loss to its self-identity or universality. Individual and actual are the same thing, only the former is issued from the notion, and is thus as a universal stated expressly as a negative identity with itself. The actual, because it at first is no more than a potential or immediate unity of essence and existence, may possibly have effect, but the individuality of the notion is the very source of effectiveness. Effective, moreover, no longer as the cause is, with the showing of affecting something else, but effective of itself. Individuality, however, is not to be understood to mean the immediate or natural individual, as when we speak of individual things or individual men, for that special phrase of individuality does not appear till we come to the judgment. Every function and moment of the notion is itself a whole notion, but the individual or subject is the notion expressly put as a totality. The notion is generally associated in our minds with abstract generality, and on that account is often described as a general conception. We speak accordingly of the notions of colour, plant, animal, etc. They are supposed to be arrived at by neglecting the particular features which distinguish the different colours, plants, and animals from each other, and retaining those common to them all. This is the aspect of the notion which is familiar to understanding, and feeling is in the right when it stigmatizes such hollow and empty notions as mere phantoms and shadows. But the universal of the notion is not a mere sum of features common to several things, confronted by a particular which enjoys an existence of its own. It is, on the contrary, self-particularizing or self-specifying, and with undimmed clearness finds itself at home in its antithesis. For the sake of both cognition and of our practical conduct, it is of the utmost importance that the real universal should not be confused with what is merely held in common. All those charges which the devotees of feeling make against thought, and especially against philosophic thought, and the reiterated statement that it is dangerous to carry thought to what they call too great lengths, originate in the confusion of these two things. The universal, in its true and comprehensive meaning, is the thought which, as we know, cost thousands of years to make it enter into the consciousness of men. The thought did not gain full recognition till the days of Christianity. The Greeks, in other respects so advanced, knew neither God nor even man in their true universality. The gods of the Greeks were only particular powers of the mind, and the universal God, the God of all nations, was to the Athenians a God concealed. They believed in the same way that an absolute gulf separated themselves from the barbarians. Man as man was not then recognized to be the infinite worth and to have infinite rights. The question has been asked, why slavery has vanished from modern Europe. One special circumstance after another has been adduced in the explanation of this phenomenon. But the real ground why there are no more slaves in Christian Europe is only to be found in the very principle of Christianity itself, the religion of absolute freedom. Only in Christendom is man respected as man in his infinitude and universality. What the slave is without is the recognition that he is a person, and the principle of personality is universality. The master looks upon his slave not as a person, but as a selfless thing. The slave is not himself reckoned an I, his I is his master. The distinction referred to above, between what is merely in common and what is truly universal, is strikingly expressed by Rousseau in his famous Contrat Social, when he says the laws of a state must spring from the universal will, volonté générale, but need not on that account be the will of all, volonté de tous. Rousseau would have made a sounder contribution towards the theory of the state if he had always kept the distinction in sight. The general will is the notion of the will, and the laws are special clauses of this will based upon the notion of it. We add a remark upon account of origin and formation of notions which is usually given in the logic of understanding. It is not we who frame the notions. The notion is not something which is originated at all. No doubt the notion is not mere being, or the immediate. It involves mediation, but the mediation lies in itself. In other words, the notion is what is mediated through itself and with itself. It is a mistake to imagine the objects of which form the content of our mental ideas come first, and that our subjective agency then supervenes, and by aforesaid operation of abstraction, and by colligating the points possessed in common by the objects, frames notions of them. Rather, the notion is the genuine first, and things are what they are through the action of the notion, immanent in them, revealing itself in them. In religious language we express this by saying that God created the world out of nothing. In other words, the world and the finite things have issued from the fullness of the divine thoughts and the divine decrees. Thus religion recognizes thought, and, more exactly, the notion to be the infinite form, or the free creative activity, which can realize itself without the help of a matter that exists outside it. The notion is concrete out and out, because the negative unity with itself as characterization, pure and entire, which is individuality, is just what constitutes its self-relation, its universality. The functions or moments of the notion are to this extent indissoluble. The categories of reflection are expected to be severally apprehended and separately accepted as current, apart from their opposites. But in the notion, where their identity is expressly assumed, each of its functions can be immediately apprehended only from and with the rest. Universality, particularity, and individuality are, taken in the abstract, the same as identity, difference, and ground. But the universal is the self-identical, with the express qualification that it simultaneously contains the particular and the individual. Again, the particular is the different or the specific character, but with the qualification that it is in itself universal and is as an individual. Similarly, the individual must be understood to be the subject or substratum, which involves the genus and species in itself and possesses a substantial existence. Such is the explicit or realized inseparability of the functions of the notion in their difference, what may be called the clearness of the notion, in which each distinction causes no dimness or interruption, but is quite as much transparent. No complaint is oftener made against the notion than that it is abstract. Of course it is abstract, if abstract means that the medium in which the notion exists is thought in general and not the sensible thing in its empirical concreteness. It is abstract also because the notion falls short of the idea. To this extent the subjective notion is still formal. This however does not mean that it ought to have or receive another content than its own. It is itself the absolute form, and so is all specific character, but as that character is in its truth. Although it be abstract, therefore, it is the concrete altogether, the subject as such. The absolutely concrete is the mind, the notion when it exists as notion distinguishing itself from its objectivity, which notwithstanding the distinction still continues to be its own. Everything else which is concrete, however rich it be, is not so intensely identical with itself and therefore not so concrete on its own part. Least of all what is commonly supposed to be concrete, but is only a congeries held together by external influence. What are called notions, and in fact specific notions such as man, house, animal, etc., are simply denotations and abstract representations. These abstractions retain out of all functions of the notion only that of universality. They leave particularity and individuality out of account and have no development in these directions. By so doing they dismiss the notion. It is the element of individuality which first explicitly differentiates the elements of the notion. Individuality is the negative reflection of the notion into itself. It is in this way the first free differentiating of it as the first negation, by which the specific character of the notion is realised, but under the form of particularity. That is to say, the different elements are in the first place only qualified as the several elements of the notion, and secondly, their identity is no less explicitly stated, the one being said to be the other. This realised particularity of notion is the judgment. The ordinary classification of notions as clear, distinct, and adequate is no part of the notion. It belongs to psychology. Notions, in fact, are here synonymous with mental representations. A clear notion is an abstract, simple representation. A distinct notion is one where, in addition to the simplicity, there is one mark or character emphasized as a sign for subjective cognition. There is no more striking mark of the formalism and decay of logic than the favourite categories of the mark. The adequate notion comes nearer the notion proper or even the idea, but after all it expresses only the formal circumstance that a notion or representation agrees with its object, that is, with an external thing. The division into what are called subordinate and coordinate notions implies a mechanical distinction of universal from particular, which allows only a mere correlation of them in external comparison. Again, an enumeration of such kinds as contrary and contradictory, affirmative and negative notions, etc., is only chance-directed gleaning of logical forms which properly belong to the sphere of being or essence, where they have been already examined, and which have nothing to do with the specific notional character as such. The true distinctions in the notion, universal, particular, and individual, may be said to constitute species of it, but only when they are kept severed from each other by external reflection. The immanent differentiating and specifying of the notion come to the sight in the judgment, for to judge is to specify the notion. The judgment. The judgment is the notion in its particularity, as a connection, which is also a distinguishing of its functions, which are put as independent and yet as identical with themselves, not with one another. One's first impression about the judgment is the independence of the two extremes, the subject and the predicate. The former we take to be a thing or term per se, and the predicate a general term outside the said subject and somewhat in our heads. The next point is for us to bring the latter into combination with the former, and in this way frame a judgment. The copula is, however, enunciates the predicate of the subject, so that external subjective assumption is again put in abeyance, and the judgment taken as a determination of the object itself. The etymological meaning of judgment, Urteil, in German goes deeper, as it were declaring the unity of the notion to be primary, and its distinction to be the original partition. And that is what the judgment really is. In its abstract terms, a judgment is expressible in the proposition, the individual is the universal. These are the terms under which the subject and the predicate first confront each other, when the functions of the notions are taken in their immediate character or first abstraction. Propositions such as the particular is the universal and the individual is the particular belong to further specialization of the judgment. It shows a strange want of observation in the logic books that in none of them is the fact stated that in every judgment there is such a statement made as the individual is the universal, or still more definitely the subject is the predicate. For example, God is the absolute spirit. No doubt there is also a distinction between terms like individual and universal, subject and predicate, but it is nonetheless the universal fact that every judgment states them to be identical. The copula is springs from the nature of the notion to be self-identical even in parting with its own. The individual and universal are its constituents, and therefore characters which cannot be isolated. The earlier categories of reflection, in their correlations, also refer to one another, but their interconnection is only having, and not being, i.e. it is not the identity which is realised as identity or universality. In the judgment, therefore, for the first time, there is seen a genuine particularity of the notion, for it is the speciality or distinguishing of the latter, without thereby losing universality. Judgments are generally looked upon as combinations of notions, and, be it added, of heterogeneous notions. This theory of judgment is correct so far as it implies that it is the notion which forms the presupposition of the judgment, and which in the judgment comes up under the form of difference. But on the other hand, it is false to speak of notions differing in kind. The notion, although concrete, is still as a notion essentially one, and the functions which it contains are not different kinds of it. It is equally false to speak of a combination of two sides in the judgment. If we understand the term combination to imply the independent existence of the combining members apart from the combination, the same external view of their nature is more forcibly apparent when judgments are described as produced by the ascription of a predicate to the subject. Language like this looks upon the subject as self-subsistent outside, and the predicate is found somewhere in our head. Such a conception of the relation between subject and predicate, however, is at once contradicted by the copula is. By saying, "This rose is red," or "This picture is beautiful," we declare that it is not we who from the outside attach beauty to the picture or redness to the rose, but that these are the characteristics proper to these objects. An additional fault in the way which formal logic conceives the judgment is that it makes judgment look as if it were something merely contingent. It does not offer any proof for the advance from notion onto judgment, for the notion does not, as understanding supposes, stand still in its own immobility. It is rather an infinite form of boundless activity, as it were the punctum saliens of all vitality, and thereby self-differentiating. This disruption of the notion into difference of its constituent functions, disruption imposed by the native act of the notion, is the judgment. A judgment therefore means the particularizing of the notion. No doubt the notion is implicitly the particular, but in the notion as notion, the particular is not yet explicit and still remains in transparent unity with the universal. Thus, for example, we remarked before, the germ of a plant contains its particulars such as root, branches, leaves, etc. But these details are at first present only potentially and are not realised till the germ uncloses. This unclosing is, as it were, the judgment of the plant. The illustration may also serve to show how neither the notion nor the judgment are merely found in our head, or merely framed by us. The notion is the very heart of things, and makes them what they are. The form of a notion of an object means therefore to become aware of its notion. When we proceed to a criticism or judgment of the object, we are not performing a subjective act and merely ascribing this or that predicate to the object. We are on the contrary observing the object in specific character imposed by its notion. The judgment is usually taken in a subjective sense as an operation and a form occurring merely in self-conscious thought. This distinction, however, has no existence on purely logical principles, by which the judgment is taken in quite universal signification that all things are a judgment. That is to say, they are individuals which are a universality or inner nature in themselves, a universal which is individualized. The universality and individuality are distinguished, but the one is at the same time identical with the other. The interpretation of the judgment, according to which it is assumed to be merely subjective, as if we ascribed a predicate to a subject, is contradicted by the decidedly objective expression of the judgment. The rose is red, gold is a metal. It is not by us that something is first ascribed to them. A judgment is, however, distinguished from a proposition. The latter contains a statement about the subject, which does not stand to it in any universal relationship, but expresses some single action or some state, or the like. Thus, Caesar was born at Rome in such a year, waged war in Gaul for 10 years, crossed the Rubicon, etc., are propositions but not judgments. Again, it is absurd to say that such statements as "I slept well last night" or "present arms" may be turned into the form of a judgment. A carriage's passing by would be a judgment, and a subjective one at best, only if it were doubtful whether the passing object was a carriage, or whether or not the point of observation was in motion. In short, only if it were desired to specify a conception which was still short of appropriate specification. The judgment is an expression of finitude. Things from its point of view are said to be finite because they are a judgment, because their definite being and their universal nature, their body and their soul, though united indeed, otherwise the things would be nothing, are still elements in constitution which are already different and also in any case separable. The abstract terms of the judgment the individual is the universal, present the subject as negatively self-relating, as what is immediately concrete, while the predicate is what is abstract, indeterminate, in short, the universal. But the two elements are connected together by an is, and thus the predicate, in its universality, must also contain the speciality of the subject, must in short have particularity. And so is realised the identity between subject and predicate, which being thus unaffected by this difference in form is the content. It is the predicate which first gives the subject, which till then was on its own a bare mental representation, or an empty name, specific character and content. In judgments like God is the most real of all things, or the Absolute is the self-identical, God and Absolute are mere names. What they are we only learn in the predicate. What the subject may be in other respects as a concrete thing is no concern of this judgment. To define the subject as that of which something is said, and the predicate as what is said about it, is mere trifling. It gives no information about the distinction between the two. In point of thought, the subject is primarily the individual, and the predicate the universal. As the judgment receives further development, the subject ceases to be merely the immediate individual, the predicate merely the abstract universal. The former acquires the additional significations of particular and universal, the latter the additional significations of particular and individual. Thus, while the same names are given to the two terms, the judgment, their meaning, passes through a series of changes. We now go closer into the speciality of subject and predicate. The subject as negative self-relation is the stable substratum in which the predicate has its subsistence, where it is ideally present. The predicate, as the phrase is, inheres in the subject. Further, as the subject is in general and immediately concrete, the specific connotation of the predicate is only one of the numerous characters of the subject. The subject is ampler and wider than the predicate. Conversely, the predicate as universal is self-subsistent and indifferent whether the subject is or not. The predicate outflanks the subject, subsuming it under itself, and hence on its side is wider than the subject. The specific content of the predicate alone constitutes the identity of the two. At first, subject, predicate, and the specific content or identity are, even in their relations, still put in judgment as different and divergent. By implication, however, that is, in their notion, they are identical. For the subject is a concrete totality, which means no any indefinite multiplicity, but individuality alone, the particular and the universal in an identity, and the predicate too is the very same unity. The copula again, even while stating the identity of subject and predicate, does so at first only by an abstract is. Conformably to such an identity, the subject has to be put also in the characteristic of the predicate. By this means the latter also receives the characteristic of the former, so that the copula receives its full complement and full force. Such is the continuous specification by which the judgment, through a copula charged with content, comes to be a syllogism. As it is primarily exhibited in the judgment, this gradual specification consists in giving to originally abstract, sensuous universality, a specific character of allness, of species, of genus, and finally the developed universality of the notion. After we have made aware of this continuous specification of the judgment, we can see a meaning and an interconnection in what are usually stated as the kinds of judgment. Not only does the ordinary enumeration seem purely casual, but it is also superficial and even bewildering in its statement of their distinctions. The distinctions between positive, categorical, and assertory judgments is either a pure invention of fancy or is left undetermined. On the right theory, the different judgments follow necessarily from one another and present the continuous specification of the notion, for the judgment itself is nothing but the notion specified. When we look at the two preceding spheres of being and essence, we see the specified notion as judgments are reproductions of these spheres, but put in the simplicity of relation peculiar to the notion. The various kinds of judgment are no empirical aggregate. They are a systematic whole based on a principle, and it was once Kant's great merits to have first emphasized the necessity of showing this. His proposed division, according to the headings in this table of categories, into judgments of quality, quantity, relation, and modality, cannot be called satisfactory, partly from the merely formal application of this categorical rubric, partly on account of their content. Still, it rests upon a true perception of the fact the different species of judgment derive their features from the universal forms of the logical idea itself. If we follow this clue, it will supply us with three chief kinds of judgment parallel to the stages of being, essence, and notion. The second of these kinds, as required by the character of essence, which is the stage of differentiation, must be doubled. We find inner ground for the systematization of judgments in the circumstance that when the notion, which is the unity of being and essence in comprehensive thought, unfolds as it does in the judgment, it must reproduce these two stages in transformation proper to the notion. The notion itself, meanwhile, is seen to mould and form a genuine grade of judgment. Far from occupying the same level and being of equal value, the different species of judgment form a series of steps, the difference of which rests upon logical significance of the predicate. That judgments differ in value is evident even in our ordinary ways of thinking. We should not hesitate to ascribe a very slight faculty of judgment to a person who habitually framed only such judgment as, this wall is green, this stove is hot. On the other hand, we should credit with a genuine capacity of judgment the person whose criticism dealt with such questions as whether a certain work of art was beautiful, whether a certain action was good, and so on. In judgments of the first mentioned kind, the contents form only an abstract quality, the presence of which can be sufficiently detected by immediate perception. To pronounce a work of art to be beautiful or an action to be good requires the contrary, a comparison of objects with what they ought to be, i.e. with their notion. Qualitative judgment. The immediate judgment is the judgment of definite being. The subject is invested with universality as its predicate, which is an immediate and therefore a sensible quality. It may be 1. A positive judgment. The individual is a particular, but the individual is not a particular, or in more precise language, such a single quality is not congruous with the concrete nature of the subject. This is 2. A negative judgment. It is one of the fundamental assumptions of dogmatic logic that qualitative judgment, such as the rose is red or is not red, can contain truth. Correct they may be, i.e. in limited circle of perception of finite conception and thought, that depend on the content which likewise is finite, and, on its own merits, untrue. Truth, however, as opposed to correctness, depends solely on the form, viz. On the notion as it is put and the reality corresponding to it. But truth of that stamp is not found in the qualitative judgment. In common life, the terms truth and correctness are often treated as synonymous. We speak of the truth of a content when we are only thinking of its correctness. Correctness, generally speaking, concerns only the formal coincidence between our conception and its content, whatever the constitution of this content may be. Truth, on the contrary, lies in the coincidence of the object with itself, that is, with its notion. That a person is sick or that someone has committed a theft may certainly be correct, but the content is untrue. A sick body is not in harmony with the notion of body, and there is want of congruity between theft and notion of human conduct. These instances may show that an immediate judgment, in which an abstract quality is predicated of an immediate individual thing, however correct it may be, cannot contain truth. The subject and predicate of it do not stand to each other in the relation of reality and notion. We may add the untruth of the immediate judgment lies in the incongruity between its form and content. To say, this rose is red, involves, in virtue of the copula is, the coincidence of subject and predicate. The rose, however, is a concrete thing, and so is not red only. It has also an odour, a specific form, and many other features not implied in the predicate red. The predicate on its part is an abstract universal and is not applied to the rose alone. There are other flowers and other objects which are red too. The subject and predicate in immediate judgment touch, as it were, only in a single point, but do not cover each other. The case is different with the notional judgment. In pronouncing an action to be good, we frame the notional judgment. Here, as we at once perceive, there is a close and more intimate relation than in the immediate judgment. The predicate in the latter is some abstract quality which may or may not be applied to the subject. In the judgment of the notion, the predicate is, as it were, the soul of the subject, by which the subject, as the body of the soul, is characterized through and through. This negation of a particular quality, which is the first negation, still leaves the connection of the subject with the predicate subsisting. The predicate is in that matter a sort of relative universal, of which a special phase only has been negatived. To say that the rose is not red implies that it is still coloured in the first place with another colour, which however would only be one more positive judgment. The individual, however, is not a universal. Hence, the judgment suffers disruption into one of two forms. It is either A, the identical judgment, an empty identical relation stating that the individual is the individual, or it is B, what is called the infinite judgment, in which we are presented with the total incompatibility of subject and predicate. Examples of the latter are: the mind is no elephant, a lion is no table. Propositions which are correct but absurd, exactly like the identical propositions, a lion is a lion, mind is mind. Propositions like these are undoubtedly true of the immediate, or as it is called, qualitative judgment, but they are not judgments at all, and can only occur in the subjective thought, where even an untrue abstraction may hold its ground. In their objective aspect, these latter judgments express the nature of what is, or of sensible things, which, as they declare, suffer disruption into an empty identity, on the one hand, and on the other fully charged relation. Only this relation is qualitative antagonism of the things related, their total incongruity. The negatively infinite judgment, in which the subject has no relation whatever to the predicate, gets its place in the formal logic solely as nonsensical curiosity. But the infinite judgment is not really a mere casual form adopted by subjective thought. It exhibits the proximate result of the dialectical process in the immediate judgments preceding, the positive and simply negative, and distinctly displays their finitude and untruth. Crime may be quoted as an objective instance of the negatively infinite judgment. The person committing a crime such as theft does not, as in a suit about civil rights, merely deny the particular right of another person to some one definite thing. He denies the right of that person in general, and therefore he is not merely forced to restore what he has stolen, but is punished in addition because he has violated law as law, i.e. law in general. The civil lawsuit, on the contrary, is an instance of the negative judgment pure and simple, where the mere particular law is violated, whilst law in general is so far acknowledged. Such a dispute is precisely paralleled by negative judgment like, "This flower is not red," by which we merely deny the particular colour of the flower, but not its colour in general, which may be blue, yellow, or another. Similarly, death, as a negatively infinite judgment, is distinguished from disease as simply negative. In disease merely this or that function of life is checked or negatived. In death, as we ordinarily say, body and soul part, i.e. subject and predicate, utterly diverge. Judgment of reflection. The individual put as individual, i.e. as reflected into self, into the judgment, has a predicate, in comparison with which the subject, as self-relating, continues to be still an other thing. In existence, the subject ceases to be immediately qualitative. It is in correlation and interconnection with another thing, with an external world. In this way, the universality of the predicate comes to signify this relativity. For example, useful or dangerous, weight or acidity, or again, instinct, are examples of such relative predicates. The judgment of reflection is distinguished from the qualitative judgment by the circumstance that a predicate is not an immediate or abstract quality, but of such a kind as to exhibit the subject as in relation to something else. When we say, for example, the rose is red, we regard the subject in its immediate individuality without reference to anything else. If, on the other hand, we frame the judgment, this plant is medicinal, we regard the subject plant as standing in connection with something else, the sickness which it cures, by means of its predicate, its medicinality. The case is the same as the judgments, like, this body is elastic, this instrument is useful, this punishment has a deterrent influence. In every one of these instances, the predicate is some category of reflection. They all exhibit and advance beyond the immediate individuality of the subject, but none of them goes so far as to indicate the adequate notion of it. It is in this mode of judgment that ordinary raisonnement luxuriates. The greater the concreteness of the object in the question, the more points of view does it offer to reflection, by which, however, its proper nature or notion is not exhausted. Firstly, then, the subject, the individual as individual, in the singular judgment, is universal. But secondly, in this relation it is elevated above its singularity. This enlargement is external due to the subjective reflection, and at first is an indefinite number of particulars. This is seen in the particular judgment, which is obviously negative as well as positive. The individual is divided in itself. Partly it is self-related, partly related to something else. Thirdly, some are the universal. Particularity is thus enlarged to universality, where universality is modified through the individuality of the subject, and appears as allness, community, the ordinary universality of reflection. The subjective receiving, as in the singular judgment, a universal predicate, is carried out beyond its mere individual self. To say, this plant is wholesome, implies not only that the single plant is wholesome, but that some or several are so. We have thus the particular judgment: some plants are wholesome, some men are inventive, etc. By means of particularity, the immediate individual comes to lose its independence and enters into an interconnection with something else. Man, as this man, is not this single man alone. He stands beside other men and becomes one in the crowd. Just by this means, however, he belongs to his universal and is consequently raised. The particular judgment is as much negative as positive. If only some bodies are elastic, it is evident that the rest are not elastic. On this fact again depends the advance to the third form of the reflective judgment, viz. the judgment of allness. All men are mortal, all metals conduct electricity. It is as all that the universal is in the first instance generally encountered by reflection. The The individual is formed for reflection the foundation, or it is only our subjective action which collects and describes them as all. So far the universal has the aspect of external fastening. It holds together a number of independent individuals, which have not the least affinity towards it. This semblance of indifference is however unreal, for the universal is the ground and foundation, the root and substance of the individual. If, for example, we take Caius, Titus, Sempronius, and other inhabitants of a town or country, the fact that all of them are men is not merely something which they have in common, but their universal or kind, without which these individuals would not be at all. The case is very different with the superficial generality, falsely so called, which really means only what attaches or is common to all individuals. It has been remarked, for example, that men, in contradistinction from the lower animals, possess in common the appendage of earlobes. It is evident, however, that the absence of these earlobes in one man or another would not affect the rest of his being, character, or capacities, whereas it would be nonsense to suppose that Caius, without being a man, would still be brave, learned, etc. The individual man is what he is in particular, only insofar as he is before all things a man as man and in general. And that generality is not something external to, or something in addition to other abstract qualities, or to mere features discovered by reflection. It is what permeates and includes in it everything particular. The subject being thus likewise characterized as a universal, there is an express identification of subject and predicate, by which at the same time speciality of judgment form is deprived of all importance. The unity of the content being the universality which is identical with the negative reflection in self of the subject, makes the connection in judgment a necessary one. The advance from the reflective judgment of allness to the judgment of necessity is found in our usual modes of thought, when we say that whatever appertains to all appertains to the species is therefore necessary. To say all plants or all men is the same thing as to say the plant or the man. Judgment of necessity. The judgment of necessity, i.e. of the identity of the content in its difference, contains in predicate partly the substance of nature of the subject, the concrete universal, the genus, partly seeing that this universal also contains the specific character as negative. The predicate represents the exclusive essential character, the species. This is the categorical judgment. 2. Conformably to their substantiality, the two terms receive the aspect of independent actuality. Their identity is inward only, and thus the actuality of the one is at the same time not its own, but the being of the other. This is the hypothetical judgment. 3. If in this self-surrender and self-alienation of the notion, its inner identity is at the same time explicitly put, the universal is the genus, which is self-identical in its mutually exclusive individualities. This judgment, which has this universal for both its terms, the one time as universal, the other time as the circle of itself excluding particularization, in the either or as much as the as well as stands for the genus, is the disjunctive judgment. Universality, at first as a genus, and now also the circuit of its species, is thus described and expressly put as a totality. The categorical judgment, such as gold is a metal, the rose is a plant, is the unmediated judgment of necessity, and finds within the sphere of essence its parallel in the relation of substance. All things are a categorical judgment. In other words, they have their substantial nature forming their fixed and unchangeable substratum. It is only when things are studied from the point of view of their kind, and as necessity determined by the kind, that the judgment first begins to be real. It betrays a defective logical training to place upon the same level judgments like gold is dear and judgments like gold is a metal. Gold is dear is a matter of external connection between it and our wants or inclinations, the cost of obtaining it and other circumstances. Gold remains the same as it was, though that external reference is altered or removed. Metality, on the contrary, constitutes the substantial nature of gold, apart from which it and all else that is in it, or can be predicated of it, would be unable to subsist. The same is the case if we say, Caius is a man. We express by that whatever else he may be has worth and meaning only when it corresponds to his substantial nature or manhood. But even the categorical judgment is to a certain extent defective. It fails to give due place to the function or element of particularity. Thus, gold is a metal, it is true, but so are silver, copper, iron. The metality as such has no leaning to any of its particular species. In these circumstances we must advance from the categorical to the hypothetical judgments, which may be expressed in the formula, if A is, B is. The present case exhibits the same advance as formerly took place from the relation of substance to the relation of cause. In the hypothetical judgment, the specific character of the content shows itself mediated and dependent on something else. And this is exactly the relation of cause and effect. And if we were to give a general interpretation of the hypothetical judgment, we should say that it expressly realizes the universal in its particularizing. This brings us to the third form of the judgment of necessity, the disjunctive judgment. A is either B or C or D. A work of poetic art is either epic or lyric or dramatic. Colour is either yellow or blue or red. The two terms in the disjunctive judgment are identical. The genus is the sum total of the species, and the sum total of the species is the genus. This unity of universal and particular is the notion, and it is the notion which, as we now see, forms the content of the judgment. Judgment of the notion. The judgment of the notion has for its content the notion, the totality in simple form, the universal with its complete speciality. The subject is, 1, in the first place, an individual, which has for its predicate the reflection of the particular existence on its universal, or the judgment states the agreement or disagreement of these two aspects. That is, the predicate is such a term as good, true, correct. This is the assertory judgment. Judgments, such as whether an object, action, etc. is good, bad, true, beautiful, etc., are those to which even ordinary language first applies the name of judgment. We should never ascribe judgment to a person who frame positive or negative judgments like, this rose is red, this picture is green, dusty, etc. The assertory judgment, though rejected by society as out of place when it claims authority on its own showing, has however been made a single and all essential form of doctrine, even in philosophy, though the influence of the principle of immediate knowledge and faith. In the so-called philosophic work, which maintain this principle, we may read hundreds and hundreds of assertions about reason, knowledge, thought, etc., which now that external authority counts for little, seek to accredit themselves by an endless restatement of the same thesis. On the part of its first unmediated subject, the assertory judgment does not contain the relation of particular with the universal, which is expressed in the predicate. This judgment is consequently a mere subjective particularity, and is confronted by a contrary assertion with equal right, or rather want of right. It is therefore at once turned into a problematical judgment. But when we explicitly attach the objective particularity to the subject, and make its speciality the constitutive feature of its existence, the subject 3 then expresses the connection of that object particularity with its constitution, i.e. with its genus, and thus expresses what forms the content of the predicate. This, the immediate individuality, house, the genus, being so and so constituted, particularity, is good or bad. The apodictic judgment, all things are a genus, i.e. have a meaning and purpose in an individual actuality of a particular constitution, and are finite because of the particular in them, nay and may not conform to the universal. In this manner, subject and predicate are the whole judgment. The immediate constitution of the subject is at first exhibited as the intermediating ground, where the individuality of the actual thing meets with its universality, and in this way is the ground of judgment. What has been really made explicit is the oneness of subject and predicate as the notion itself, filling up the empty is of the copula. While its constituent elements are at the same time distinguished as subject and predicate, the notion is put as their unity, as the connection which serves to intermediate them, in short, as the syllogism. End of Part 1 of Chapter 9. Recording by Ryan Smallwood.